Delivery of the child is known as parturition. And in humans, that usually occurs between the 38th and the 40th week of gestation. Usually. There's a lot of variability here, and it's not uncommon for babies to come a little later than the 40th week, or a little early. Fetuses are viable, meaning they can survive. These days, we actually can keep fetuses alive that come quite early, premature births. There are complications that can occur, but modern technology can support the fetus as early as, say, 26 weeks. Not without hardship, not without difficulty, not without risk. And so most doctors are going to try to get you to that 38th week, if at all possible, before you deliver the baby. We're not entirely sure what the trigger is. You hear all sorts of myths and so forth about how to induce labor. As far as I know, they are just that, myths. There are some things that the doctors can do, including stripping membranes and breaking the amniotic sac in order to try to encourage delivery. There are medications as well that can be used also. But a lot of the other tricks that you hear about eating spicy food, having sex, those types of tricks are, for the most part, just myths. The baby will come when the baby's ready to come. And at some point, once the baby reaches, or the fetus reaches maturity, or is mature enough, I should say, then the mother will experience these rhythm contractions of the uterus that is going to push the fetus out into the world. Now, those contractions at first are irregular, then they become more regular but spread apart, farther apart, and then the contractions become more intense and closer together until finally the baby is born. All of this occurs due to a positive feedback cycle. We don't really understand the initial trigger, as I've mentioned. There are certain things that can trigger it, but we don't necessarily know a lot about exactly what starts this process. But what happens, though, is at some point the baby or the fetus is going to begin to drop in the uterus. And as it drops, the head of the baby is going to push against the cervix. This will cause the cervix to stretch. There are stretch receptors in the cervix, and those stretch receptors, they're neurons, they're sensory neurons, mechanoreceptors, and they will send information to the hypothalamus, which will regulate the secretion of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. So in response to that stretch, oxytocin is released. Now, oxytocin has a number of jobs. I've mentioned when we talked about this in the endocrine system that oxytocin is responsible for bonding and is released by the brain in response to cuddling and gazing into the eyes of a loved one and so forth. But in labor and delivery, its function, the most important function that it has, is actually to stimulate smooth muscle contraction. Oxytocin stimulates the release of prostaglandins. And you'll remember those prostaglandins? We talked about how some of those prostaglandins communicate pain. And some of those prostaglandins actually cause smooth muscle contraction. We spoke of them when we talked about ejaculation and how prostaglandins cause the spasming of the smooth muscles during ejaculation. Here, these prostaglandins are going to promote uterine contraction, and so oxytocin does it both directly and indirectly through the release of these prostaglandins. Now, as the uterus contracts, what this does is causes the fetus's head to push harder against the cervix, and therefore, that will cause additional cervical stretch as we start to force the head of the baby out through the cervix. And so consequently, that additional stretch will cause the release of more oxytocin, which will cause greater uterine contractions. And so we get this ramping up of the contractions. They become more intense, they become closer together. And so this is a positive feedback, one of the few positive feedback processes that we have that are important to our species. Importantly, during childbirth, homeostasis is lost. Okay, this process is not at all about maintaining a homeostasis. Not about homeostasis. On the other hand, it's about reproduction of the species, which is critical to the survival of the species. Once the baby has been delivered, though, now the uterine stretch will drop. So the delivery of the baby reduces uterine stretch. Now we do get some of this happening again as we deliver the afterbirth, otherwise known as the placenta. But the process essentially stops once the baby is delivered. Now that doesn't include some of the spasming and so forth that occur as an after effect of childbirth that can continue for several hours to days later as the uterine contracts and returns to its normal shape and size. Those are different processes, but this is the positive feedback loop that occurs during delivery. We also see a positive feedback loop that occurs in response to lactation and the suckling of the infant. Let's look at those mammary glands and milk secretion. Now, development of the glands, of the ducts and the mammary gland itself relies on estrogen. Progesterone too, but estrogen is the primary hormone in this process. Okay, so it stimulates mammary gland development. Breasts enlarge, they tend to become tender, and they prepare to secrete milk. The actual secretion of milk relies on the hormone of prolactin. Okay, prolactin is going to cause milk production. Estrogen causes the development of the breast tissue, but prolactin causes the milk production. Let's take a look on the right at the control pathways for this milk production, and then we're also going to take a look at oxytocin, and I'll talk about that as well. So, you may recall that under normal circumstances, the hypothalamus is releasing a hormone called prostaglandin inhibiting hormone. That's the regulating hormone that is constantly being released. Steady drip of this prostaglandin inhibiting hormone, and so under normal circumstances we don't make prostaglandin. But in response to, or once a child is born, in response to that child suckling, but even just sounds of baby crying and so forth will stimulate the production of milk. The way that works is this prostaglandin, let's look at this, the prostaglandin inhibiting hormone is suppressed, and so my prostaglandin inhibiting hormone drops. It goes down. By the way, don't forget that the other name for PIH is dopamine. Okay, dopamine. When PIH levels drop, prolactin is suddenly released from the anterior pituitary, and that is going to act on the breast tissue to promote milk production and secretion. The milk will be secreted from these mammary glands. You can see them right here. There's a lot of fat tissue, of course, in the breast, and that's normal. And these glands here produce that milk and release it into these ducts. Let me highlight the ducts right there. There's my ducts. And those ducts bring the milk down into larger ducts. Okay. That will empty out of the body through the nipple. Okay. These milk ducts. Now, suckling, let's go down to this one here. Oops, nope, I don't want that one here. We're going to go here. Suckling, moving back in here, will activate mechanoreceptors in the nipple. And those mechanoreceptors will activate sensory information, and this sensory information feeds into the hypothalamus and again is going to suppress the production of prostaglandin inhibiting hormone or dopamine. Also, the suckling will promote the release of oxytocin. So here we have oxytocin again. Oxytocin release is stimulated, and that oxytocin is released from the posterior pituitary, travels to the smooth muscles, and causes muscle contraction. Often people assume or think that milk is sucked. Okay, we even call it suckling, right? Milk is sucked by the infant into the infant's mouth. But it's actually not. The suckling action triggers an ejection reflex, and that infant will have milk literally squirt into their mouth that they can swallow through the suckling effect. This is also one of the reasons why a baby who is breastfed, sometimes has a hard time transitioning to a bottle, because the bottle they actually do need to suckle on or draw in through changing pressures within their mouth. But with oxytocin, we have that ejection of milk. Oxytocin sometimes is known as the love hormone, and so we actually get the effect of oxytocin acting in the brain, and it stimulates and promotes bonding. Fortunately, suckling is not the only way you can bond with your infant. Even just the action of cuddling and hugging and singing and cradling your infant will produce oxytocin in your brain. So those infants who cannot be nursed can still, or mother and child can still bond even in the absence of the suckling. And mother and father can still, of course mother and father can bond, but I meant mother or father and baby also can bind, because oxytocin will be released through other mechanisms too. Now, the very first milk that is produced, and sometimes this takes a day or two, milk doesn't instantly come in. Sometimes the baby is born and the mother has no milk for a short time, and that of course can be distressing to the mother, but for most mothers the milk will eventually come in and be produced in time to nurse the child. The very first milk that is produced is a thicker milk, yellow in color, and it's called colostrum. And this milk contains antibodies from the mother. This is a form of passive immunity. You might remember this. Passively acquired immunity received from the mother through that milk. It's actually extremely important in helping protect the infant from infections, as the infant doesn't really they have the beginnings of an acquired immune system, but the T cells and the B cells, they're naive. They haven't been exposed to pathogens before. They are not ready to really fight off infection, and so the infant is reliant on their innate immune system without antibodies of their own. And so this colostrum is quite important in terms of protecting the infant from infection. I already talked about this previously. Here's the slide that I was looking for about oxytocin, so I'll let you go ahead and just read that. And that's it. That brings us to a close for the reproductive system. I hope you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we will pick up next week with the digestive system.